Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, 4700 Grover Avenue. Welcome to our Public Affairs Forum. These forums are free and open to the public and are scheduled almost every Sunday at noon. For more information about our Public Affairs Forum, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Tom, universally known as Smitty, Smith, and he's going to be speaking on ethics in Texas government, an oxymoron. Texas government is reeling due to scandals in the way we fund our cancer research. Our lieutenant governor has been robbed by a trusted aide and failed to notice. And the power of the lobby is once again taking over the Capitol. Citizens United has allowed corporations to secretly fund elections. What solutions are being offered? And can they pass? How can the average citizen help? Smitty has been director of Public Citizens Texas office since 1985. He's testified over 1,000 times on energy and other issues before the Texas legislature and U.S. Congress. One of his primary goals is to combat global warming. He's also helped pass many laws that have reduced use of carbon fuels in Texas. He's won over a dozen awards for his advocacy work, including the Heinz Award, and was recently recognized by Politico magazine as one of the 25 most influential Democrats in Texas. He is a fearless champion of social and environmental justice, and I'm proud to have him here today as our speaker. Welcome, Smitty.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm honored to be here with you, and thanks for all you do. Time after time, I have appeared before you and your predecessors in these pews, and as a result, I've seen things change, policies change, both here in Austin, at Austin City Council, or at the legislature when the Austin delegation gets activated. And I would like to ask you once again for your help on a variety of issues. We're going to be talking today about the whole issue of ethics in Texas government and whether it's an oxymoron, and I'll give the answer quickly. It's yes. We also have a couple of other opportunities to make some significant difference in the way we regulate our oil and gas industry. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's so critical and what those opportunities are. And in the middle of the week, Dale emailed me and said, hey, we've been having these series of folks talking about environmental issues, in particular climate change and global warming. Can you mention that? And I was delighted to hear that because that is one of my driving passions. And so I will tell you the story about climate change regulation in Texas and how it has been subverted by campaign finance and contributions and the oil and gas industry, and then how it all wraps up into the whole issue of ethics and campaign finance reform, and what can be done about it. And we are at a point in the legislature where there are a couple of pieces of legislation that are moving through that I will visit with you a little bit about, all of which need some calls from yourselves and from your friends around the state in the next week. And so it would be useful to have some action taken. And let me begin by telling you a little bit about my background to give you some sense of how I got involved in all this and why I'm so passionate and why I'm a believer in citizen action. I'm a child of the 60s, and when I was going to college, I was going to a place in northern Indiana called Valparaiso, which was anything except a valley of paradise. But it was downwind from the big steel mills in Gary, Indiana. And it snowed a lot there. And when it would snow for about 2 hours, we had white, pristine snow. And then they'd pop open the basic oxygen furnaces at the big steel mill in Gary, and we'd be inundated with a cloud of black soot. The soot was so bad that the trees on one side and the dominant side had become blackened by the soot, and so there had been a genetic change in the squirrels in the time of one of my friend's fathers who had lived there all of his life. So instead of having brown squirrels, we had black squirrels, and that was the dominant squirrel life form because there was so much soot on the trees. And the pollution in Lake Michigan was so bad that we were having massive fish kills. The alewives were being starved because of the amount of sewage and phosphates and other things that were being dumped into Lake Michigan and were pulling the oxygen down. And we, students, older environmentalists, people in churches, all began to work together across the country, and in about a 5-year period of time, we passed the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And as a result, we no longer have fish kills in Lake Michigan. We no longer have suds on all of our streams and rivers, and the phosphates have virtually disappeared. And you no longer have steel mills in Gary, Indiana. They've all moved, I think, to India and China. But what has happened in that community is that you no longer have the air pollution that used to eat the paint off of your cars, used to coat the trees, and the squirrels have now regeneticized themselves, whatever the term is I'm looking for. The genetic change has happened once again, and we now have brown squirrels in northern Indiana. And there's a manifest and significant difference because we as people got together and organized and stopped a significant threat to our environment. And in my generation, I can see the manifest impacts of the work we all have done together. During that period of time, I did air pollution work. As a college student, it wasn't what I thought I was going to do when I grew up, but it was one of those student jobs you get that really profoundly changes you. And so I have gotten this bug understanding just how bad air pollution could be from those kinds of action or that kind of training that I got as a student intern. And so one of the commitments and one of the life passions I've had is training kids how to participate in government and in order to have them understand what the tools are for affecting significant social change. Last count, we've had 350 interns through our shop. About 50 of them I keep in touch with and are somewhere in government in Texas or elsewhere and are making profound changes. A number of them now work at the legislature and have for years. And they too are making significant differences. One of them, a guy named Connor Kinney, who works for State Representative Lon Burnham as their chief of staff, is the only intern I've ever had that actually fell asleep at his computer while writing testimony and was still in his suit the next morning when I walked in at 7:30 and said, Connor, it's time to wake up and finish the testimony. But a lot of them turned out to be dedicated. Connor was so good that he was the first intern I ever had that I entirely turned over a major package of legislation on ethics. And let me begin that whole story about ethics legislation by talking about why our ethics in Texas is screwed up. And there are several different reasons why that's the case. The most important is that we don't pay our legislators enough for them to live on or really to run for office. We treat them like dirt. We pay them $600 a month, $7,200 a year to come down here and work extraordinarily hard. Last time I did a survey, which has been about 10 years ago, the average legislator spent about 60 hours a week during the legislature, when the legislature was in session, working on legislative matters, and that excluded travel time back and forth to wherever they live. So if you're living in Dallas, that's 3.5 hours each way, or Houston, or Abilene, or El Paso, and most legislators drive back and forth until you get out into way West Texas. The second major problem is that, and it's a good thing and a bad thing, is that we have a citizen legislature, which means that, excuse me, let me finish the point here, that on average they spend 30 hours a week doing legislative work when they're not in session. So more than 3/4 of their time, they're answering constituent calls, they're going out and making speeches, they're doing something that takes time away from their ability to generate or earn money. So when you look at who's in the legislature, it's not surprising to find that in the Texas legislature, they sort of generally fit into 3 categories, and this is a gross generalization, so please excuse me, but it is that you have about 1/3 of the members who are wealthy and can afford to be in the legislature because they have enough money, either that they have earned or inherited, that they don't have to work. About 1/3 of them are there because it somehow benefits their employers, or because they see it as a way to get consulting contracts or to enrich themselves as a lawyer, or there's some business benefit to them. And about 1/3 of them are there because they're passionate, and they are the people we really want in the legislature, who are there because they care about civil rights and civil justice, about women's rights, about the environment, about abortion, about getting big government off our back. And many of those passionate people make the transition into being multi-issue legislators that are really the state's people we wish that they would be. Then there are several who realize that there's only 1 or 2 votes on an abortion bill every session, and they're lost, and they don't know what to do because that's all they ran on, that's all they thought they would do when they got there. And so they play follow the leader, and they follow whomever the dominant Republican or Democrat is in the House, and they are not particularly thoughtful or particularly effective members. So who steps in these to help these folks? There's a combination of factors that make our legislators extremely dependent on campaign contributions and on the lobbyists around the legislature. Not only is it lack of money to survive on, but there's also the lack of real input by ordinary citizens in an effective and an organized way that make them dependent on the lobby. The Capitol, in many ways, is analogous to a large high school, maybe 4,000 people. There's sort of the in crowd of 181 members of the legislature who are really the decision makers, and the staff, which are probably double that number. So there are probably 600 folks who are, the legislators and their key staff members that really influence decisions. And then the other 3,500 are the lobbyists. Of that 3,500, there are about 800 more or less professional, full-time lobbyists who really are there all the time before the legislators get there and often after the legislators leave, who are the people who provide them with the information and the vast majority of the data they use to make decisions, and are in control of the vast majority of the campaign funds. So how does this work? So say you're a lobbyist for the oil and gas industry. What happens is you're in a position where you've got a major bill going through, and next session you're going to try and change the rules that allocate how much natural gas can come out of a certain set of wells. So what you do is, as that member of the legislature is running for office, you hold campaign fundraisers for them. As they start to look at being in the legislature during the next session, you say to all your members, Representative Driver or Representative Smitty or whatever, is an insurance agent. One way that you can significantly help to make sure he can afford to be in the legislature is to transfer all of the insurance from your oil and gas operations to Joe Driver's State Farm Insurance Agency. And so Driver understands that not only is this a large benefit he is getting from the oil and gas industry, but that this is premium product that he can charge a bit extra for to make sure that his, and I don't know that he does, but this is the way this works. is that people understand that the system is set up to where there are certain people you can charge more than the market might otherwise bear because they're seeking legislative help. And again, I don't know that Driver ever did that or any of the other members have done that, but that's generally the understanding. So then you're in a situation where you as a consultant or there are a variety of folks in the business who are consultants, but without knowing, but today our forums are that tell us how people are employed, give us just a generation or just a occupation. And a lot of people put down consultants, but we don't have the data within that to understand who it is they're really working for. Are they consultants to the oil and gas industry? If they're attorneys, do they represent large insurers? Or are they trial lawyers that will benefit by a favorable tort law change? Or in their assets, our asset today are capped and say that people have categories of assets up to $25,000. And beyond that, it's anybody's guess what percentage of their assets they may have invested in oil and gas or in automobile dealerships or in a major power company. And so we really don't know who's influenced not only by those who employ them, but by their personal holdings. And therein is the real significant problem about the way our Texas legislature operates, is that the mechanism we have today to catch conflicts of interest is fundamentally flawed and broken. We don't have the data necessary to do that. And one of the issues that we're going to be pushing is trying to get that information available on the internet immediately so we have that kind of data available in far greater detail. One of the other big issues that we have today is that the Ethics Commission, the entity that was designed to police the ethics of the state of Texas, is inherently broken. Many of you remember when Ann Richards was running for governor, there were a number of scandals involving the Speaker of the House at that particular time and a number of other high elected officials. And she ran on the premise that she would create an independent ethics commission that had enforcement powers and that they would be able to go after legislators and other high officials that were doing wrong. During that session of the legislature, however, that ethics commission platform that she had, where she had 13 points, got so badly watered down that it has become a political cover-up agency as opposed to an agency that really enforces or investigates ethics issues. And how did that happen? There was a deal made somewhere along the line, instead of having eminent ethics officials that would actually have the ability to enforce the law and understand what the ethical principles would be, that the Ethics Commission would be comprised of 8 members, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and that they would be chosen by the political elite in the House and Senate. So basically, it's set up to protect the politicians just by its very composition. And then another deal got done that said it would take 6 out of 8, a supermajority, to initiate any investigation or to audit or to refer someone over to prosecution. So just to give you an example, in 2010, they received 374 complaints about ethical misconduct in the state of Texas, and they referred exactly 0 to the prosecuting attorney. They initiated 0 investigations and 0 audits. What kind of ethics watchdog is that? It's one that's fundamentally broken. And what we have now is an opportunity, because that Ethics Commission is undergoing what's known as sunset review, to turn this around. And so one of the pitches I would like to make to you is we're going to need some help in the House and the Senate to call your legislators and say, we need to do a number of things to change the basic construct around the Ethics Commission. And the most important of which is to create an independent enforcement division that basically, that the commission would set by rule what it is they're supposed to look at, and then hire an enforcement director. There are about 250 state agencies in the state of Texas. About 150 of them regulate in some way a profession or professionals. Every one of those others has an enforcement director and an enforcement division that makes a decision when a complaint comes in, whether this is important, whether this is mere paperwork violations, and how to proceed. The Texas Ethics Commission does not. Every complaint has to be prepared by staff and go to the commission, and then they make a decision as to the seriousness of it, and then do nothing with it. Now, when we've looked at the nature of complaints, what we've discovered is that the vast majority of them are minor complaints having to do with somebody not filling out paperwork. And then there's some where maybe you really ought to look at them and have a decision whether or not you ought to smote them for having covered something up or maybe not made disclosures that they knew they should have gone after. And then about 3% are serious and really need investigation. And so we need to refocus the priorities of this ethics commission and have them quit going after minnows and really go after the sharks and have an independent division. Ethics enforcement division would make a big difference there. Another major issue is that nobody's really looking at the books over there. They've never done a random audit. They've never audited anybody. So what's happened recently, embarrassingly for the lieutenant governor, is that because there was never any fear that anybody would audit the campaign funds of a major campaign like the lieutenant governor's, his campaign aide, allegedly, was siphoning off money, using it or authorizing the expenditures of that money through companies that he had an association with and then not spending the money appropriately. And this went on for years. And the net may be in excess of somewhere between $800,000 and the latest I have heard is maybe more than $1 million taken from the lieutenant governor and just misused. And this is one of the common complaints you hear from legislators is, I trust my campaign consultant, sort of, but I don't really know that the money is being appropriately spent or effectively spent or spent at market-based prices. And so a campaign consultant in the heat of a campaign can say, Representative, we need to spend some money to buy some ads. Here's the budget. And he says, Shine, go ahead, we've got enough money to do that. He never really knows if that's the price that TV ads are being going for, or if that's the best you can do in terms of signs. And the campaign consultants often take a rake off of every dollar they spend on ads or on signs or on labor. That's part of the way they get paid. And so the more they spend on this stuff, the more they make, so it's in their economic best interest to do that. But nobody ever audits them. Nobody actually checks to see if the trip paid for out of campaign funds to New York was legitimate or appropriate or whether it was just a junket. And so we really have to do random audits. And we also need to make sure that when there are hearings, that they're not just being held within the Ethics Commission, but that they're actually being held by a hearings agency that knows what they're doing. And in Texas, we have something called the State Office of Administrative Hearings that holds hearings for roughly 85 different state agencies that are pros on how to hold hearings and make sure the decisions are fair. So this is all up right now. There is a hearing Monday over in the House Elections Committee on Representative Bonin's bill on ethics. And then we expect that the Senate bill will be on the floor later part of this week. And that one is Senate Bill 219. And that's the number we would ask you to make some calls on to our Texas senators, Watson, Campbell, Frazier, and Swertner, I think is the other one that somehow is up in the northeastern part of the city. And then to our House members. And by the way, Donna Howard is a real trooper. And she is one of those people who has really strong ethics, integrity, and she's somebody who has been carrying stuff, not because it benefits her politically, because it's the right thing to do. And I can't thank her enough for what she has done over time. Now I'm going to swing in a little bit and talk about climate change and global warming, and then come back and talk about the Railroad Commission and similar ethics issues in front of the Texas Railroad Commission. Texas leads the nation in the gases that cause global warming. If we were a nation unto ourselves, we would be number 6 in terms of the total amount of global warming emissions that we emit. We used to be number 7, but because Germany has been so aggressive in terms of reducing its emissions, we now have dropped, they have dropped, we're now above Germany in terms of our total global warming emissions. If you took the 2nd and 3rd states in terms of global warming emissions, California and Pennsylvania, their emissions would not equal ours combined. Where does it come from? Simplistically, you could divide Texas's emissions into a third, roughly. Roughly 30% of it comes from our power generating sources. Roughly 30% comes from highways and our cars and trucks. And roughly 30% from the other industrial stuff, and the remaining 10% from agriculture, our homes, all that sort of stuff. Now, we in Texas have done virtually nothing to abate our global warming gases. And so what you see is year after year after year, they have gone up with one exception, or several exceptions, in the late 1990s and early 2000s when we started building a lot of wind power. And then suddenly they began to go down because we put so much wind power on that it was displacing old coal plants. And then Governor Perry authorized the building of a bunch of new coal plants, and it went back up again. But we have a tremendous opportunity to reduce those global warming gases and put far more people to work than would be displaced. One of my favorite examples is that we now employ about 7,500 people in the wind industry, and there are only 5,500 people, 5,735, working in the coal industry in the entire state of Texas. And that's because of policies that people like yourself advocated for in the late 1990s that ended up changing the way we generate electricity. And now we lead the nation in our generation of renewable energy. And we have a lot more to go, but it is because of that. And Austin leads the nation in the consumption of, on a pro-rata basis, of renewable energy. There are other cities like San Antonio, Los Angeles, and other places that actually have more renewable energy coming in. But our city, on a pro-rata basis, is number 1 in terms of how much we as each citizen gets from a renewable. And that's because of advocacy of folks like yourselves and ourselves. So in 2000, we initiated a package of rules that said, that took, let me back up. In 1991, there was a piece of legislation that was adopted that basically said Texas was authorized to reduce its global warming emissions. And so they never did anything from 1991 to 2000. And so in 2000, we initiated a package of rulemaking saying, do something. And we had 16 different things we thought they could do to significantly reduce global warming emissions. And the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality studied them and said, you know what, we really don't know enough about the sources of global warming gases because nobody's required to report them at this point to do any intelligent rulemaking. All we have are estimates about how much global warming gases are being emitted based on the amount of fuel consumed. And so we now have the capacity to actually measure the amount of carbon dioxide or other gases that are causing global warming. We ought to do that. So we said, okay, that's a good compromise. We'll pull all our petitions for rulemaking and we'll do 2 years of study to figure out where they're coming from, get the reports, and come back later. Well, the day of the hearing, I had talked to the chairman of the commission around 10:30 at night the night before when he was driving home from choir practice. And the morning of the hearing, he pulls me over and he says, the governor's office spiked our deal. And I said, why? He says, I can't tell you. And I said, well, thanks, pal. But he said, your deal's been spiked. We're not even going to do a study to figure out where this is coming from. And later on, an enterprising reporter talked to somebody in the governor's office and said it was the oil and gas guys that spiked your deal. And what we discovered was that the oil and gas industry is terrified of anybody knowing how much methane leaks out of their systems. Methane's 22 times more potent a global warming gas than carbon dioxide is. So the guesstimate is that if you really looked at the emissions coming off of natural gas, extraction, piping, refining, and combustion, that today in Texas, it would equal that of all the coal plants in Texas. So it would be roughly as much as 30% is today of the total emissions, or somewhere in the neighborhood of about 600 million tons a year. It's a stunning amount of methane that is being leaked. And they really don't want anybody to know this, because it would mean extraordinary amounts of costs of retrofit on all of these various plants, or all these extraction devices. And so if you use the best practices, however, if you had no leaks of methane, the total amount of emissions coming from a natural gas plant, all of the extraction, would be about half of that coming from all the coal plants in the state of Texas. And that's a general rule of thumb, is done appropriately. Now, how do we know this, and where do you see this? I don't know if any of you have flown to Dallas recently and seen the extraordinary number of drilling pads between basically Waxahachie and all the way up north into Parker County, where it seems like every 500 yards there's another drilling pad for a fracking operation. Or been down to the Barnett Shale or to the Eagle Ford, driving down back and forth to Corpus Christi. But we have roughly 17,000 wells in the Barnett Shale, and about 5,000 wells, as I recall, down in the Eagle Ford Shale, all of which have been hastily and quickly built. And what we see down in the Eagle Ford Shale, particularly at night, is the extraordinary number of flares going off, where gas is being vented into the atmosphere or burned in the atmosphere, because they simply don't have the pipelines in place to be able to dispose of the natural gas or to ship it off to markets. And there's frankly no market for natural gas. And so when you dig into it, what you find is these guys all signed contracts that said, if we don't produce on your property within 2 years, we lose your lease. And so they're all busy trying to get their wells drilled and in long before the pipeline infrastructure necessary to handle the natural gas is put in place. Now, they're doing it for oil because oil is valuable, but natural gas is so low priced now that they don't put the money or the time into getting the pipelines in place before they build the pipes or do the wells. So as a result, you have these extraordinary amounts of natural gas that is just being vented into the atmosphere, or methane, that is increasing the amount of global warming. And as a result, our climate is being more and more and more threatened by fracking and by the consumption of natural gas, both here in Texas and the rest of the world. And frankly, we're pretty much powerless to stop that at this point. There are 2 pieces of legislation I want to talk with you about in that regard. One of them is the Railroad Commission Sunset Bill, and that's down at the very bottom of the ethics sheet, House Bill 2166. And what we're trying to do to abate those emissions is get a handle on campaign contributions. What we know about campaign contributions in the Texas Railroad Commission is it's unlimited, anytime, and 80 to 90% of the contributions come in from people who work in the oil and gas industry. It's an extraordinary amount of money, $2.6, $2.3, $2.1 million a year, or in a cycle rather, come in from the oil and gas industry to the Railroad Commission. So who do you think they're going to pay attention to? It's not people like us. It's not environmentalists. It's the oil and gas guys who want to do this. So when the Railroad Commission says we want to do rules to reduce the amount of flaring going on down at these plants, they get watered down, diluted, they get postponed, and these guys keep blowing and going and blowing and going. Now, there is legislation being pending right now, and the oil and the campaign contribution limits have been stripped out. We had in there, and we'd like to get amended back in there, a provision that basically says you can't take contributions from anybody that's got a contested case pending. And you can only take them for a 17-month period of time, close to when you're actually running for election. And if you're going to run for another office, you have to resign. And we want to limit it to $10,000. Let me say this a different way. 51% of the contributions coming into the railroad commissioners are over $10,000. There ought to be a limit in Texas even about how much good government you can buy with your campaign contributions. There are people who are kicking in $200,000, $150,000, and what are they going to get from their expenditures? Obviously, they're going to get favors when it comes time to permitting or allocation, what have you. There's also legislation pending in the Texas legislature that would eliminate even the one section we have that would help us abate global warming. House Bill 788 is designed to allow Texas to permit global warming gases. And under Texas law, as I mentioned, the TCEQ has the authority to reduce global warming gases or to regulate it, but that's being removed in this law. And all that will remain is the right of the TCEQ to actually permit emissions and require some controls on new sources, but nothing on the old sources. And so we're opposing that, and we'd like to ask you as well to call the House members this week in the Texas delegation that you know and ask them to vote against this bill. It also eliminates the contested case hearing, which is where you actually get an analysis of where the best controls are. Now, I'm going to spend just a couple minutes really quickly talking about what the impacts of global warming are, and then we'll wrap up and go to questions. Texas is also the hot spot in terms of impacts of global warming. Any of you who were here in 2011 have a foretaste of what's likely to be our future in this state. And we are in 2011 where we expected to be if we did nothing to abate global warming gases in 2050. We had 90 days of over 100 degrees. And we began to see our rivers and streams shrink. The LCRA says that the water flow from the Colorado River Basin will decline somewhere between 13 and 35% by 2050. It's happening already. You can see significant die-off in our forests in East Texas, and the impacts on agriculture are projected to be in the billions. And in that particular year, the impacts to agriculture were $6.5 billion in terms of climate-related damage to agriculture in 2011. The coastal areas are likely to get significantly wetter. East of I-35 is going to rain a lot more, and torrential rains. West of I-35, it's going to rain a lot less, and it'll become more and more arid as we go to the west. And we'll see species changing dramatically. And what we're now seeing is spring is 3 weeks earlier in much of Texas, and fall 3 weeks later in terms of when crops are ready to be harvested or ready to be fertilized. And as a result, Professor Camille Parmesan here at the University of Texas has said we're beginning to see as much as a 5% decline in the fertility of various kinds of plants because our birds and bees often migrate based on light patterns that have to do with the length of our days, but our plants blossom and become fertile based on temperature. So when it gets hotter earlier in the spring, the plants bloom, thinking it's time for them to be fertilized, and the bees haven't left Mexico or wherever yet. So we're beginning to see a significant change, and already 5% decline. Now, all of these things are things we can do something about. There are a number of different ways to reduce global warming gases, many of which we're doing here in Austin aplenty, using renewable energy. And just to share with you a moment of triumph from this month, I think it was on April 7th, 51% of the energy consumed by us in Austin came from renewable energy for the first time. So we've now passed the 50% stage, and we're going to grow that. Beginning to use our energy more efficiently. Weatherization, tidying up our houses. On average, we could save roughly 23% of the energy we use in the hottest summer days. passenger vehicle efficiency and changing the way we power our vehicles. Several of us in this room own plug-in electric vehicles. I have a Chevrolet Volt, and I have not put gas in my car for 45 days. And I power it off of solar panels, or let me turn around the other way. I produce enough energy off of my solar panels that in many days of the year, I power my house and my car off of the power of the sun. And I understand you've got a tremendous system here at the church. And then looking at ways to capture carbon and use it more efficiently. These are all things we can do, and we're leading in Texas in many ways on, but we're not really developing the plans to actually do this in the kind of intensity necessary to reduce and abate the climatic changes. And frankly, until we get our campaign contributions and our way we finance our legislature under control, we're not going to be able to do that. The lock the oil and gas industry has on the Texas legislature is so profound that the kinds of systemic changes we're going to need are not going to happen unless we get some campaign contribution limits on the oil and gas industry, and frankly other industries as well. But this session, because we've got a sunset bill on oil and gas going through, I'm targeting oil and gas. We need to get the coal guys under control too. But until we make some substantial changes in the way we do our ethics, it's all interlinked. And the climate alone, the dramatic changes in our climate, are not enough to get our legislators aware and believing we've got to make changes. And in fact, we're going retrograde. And so what my pitch is to you and my ask to you is, I need some help. We need some help in the Texas legislature. There are 3 bills here that are all pending next week. And if you can call your House members and your senators and say, I'm in favor of tough ethics reforms and enforcement at the Ethics Commission, and those who, and on the Railroad Commission sunset bill, we've got to have contribution limits in it. And lastly, don't gut our global warming legislation and toughen it. I think we can make a difference. But it will take all of you making those calls, and importantly, calling several of your friends who live out of Austin and asking their legislators as well will make a big difference. And hearkening back to what we did when I was young and what we have done as communities time after time, it typically takes 5 calls before somebody thinks, a member of the legislature thinks something's an issue. 10 calls can change their mind. And we all know 10 people, and we can make those calls, and we can make a difference. And thanks for all you've done in the past, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have at this point.
Thank you, Smitty. Raise your hands high. Okay. Martha, stand up and say your name. And, we need to keep our questions brief so we can hear from our speaker.
Martha Schumacher, I understand that France gets 80% of their power from nuclear. You haven't talked about nuclear. What's wrong with having more nuclear plants here? Speak to that, please.
The biggest problem with nuclear plants is what you do with the waste and the high risk of accidents. In a post-Fukushima world, one of the things we're aware of, even well-designed Japanese nuclear power plants are far more vulnerable than a wind turbine or even a coal plant to an explosion or accident that can have profound genetic effects. And what happened and what's happening in France is that because of the increases in temperature in France, they're not able to keep the cooling water for their nukes cool enough to operate. And so in the summer, I think it was of 2010, I think they were a year ahead in terms of their really hot year, they had to turn off or turn down many of their nukes because the temperature was just so hot. And we've come close to that here in Texas in 2009. The cooling water at South Texas was so hot that we had to turn it down and began to see questions about its availability over the course of that summer because the cooling water was up very close to critical limits. And without cooling water, we're sunk. Those things can quickly go out of control. And so relying on additional nukes basically is only going to exacerbate that situation because they're very intensive in terms of the heat they put back into the cooling systems.
We have a question here. Crockett?
Hi. Yes, on the three bills you asked us to deal with, the Senate Bill 219, House Bill 1788. You are talking about contacting the senators and House members for the Texas legislature. As someone who has moved here just not that long ago, how does one find information on who they are and how to contact them?
There's Texas does many things right. Among one of the things we do very well is we have something called Texas Legislature Online. It's a website for our legislature. And you have a Who Represents Me piece in there, so you can just plug in your zip code, and you'll find out if Elliot Neistat or Donna Howard or whomever is your state rep. And your state senator will come up as well, as will your member of Congress. But most importantly, a lot of times making calls to people who are in other parts of the city as well is important, because we are blessed with a really good delegation here. And if they're getting calls from people all over the city, they'll accept them and think, oh, this is important. So it's you can look in the phone book and the blue pages, and there's a listing of all your representatives. You can just Google up Austin State Representatives. And then when you call in, ask to talk to the aide that is working on environmental issues or on Railroad Commission or on ethics issues. Most House members have one or two aides. The senators have typically 5 or 6 that are working on different issues. And so whomever is at the desk will help refer you to the right person. Get their name and then give them a holler back after a while and see if they've had a chance to talk to the senator about that issue. And typically every Senate staff have meetings in the mornings with the senator to brief them on the calls that have come in and who's called. And so these calls do matter a lot.
David Hogan, I wonder if you'd comment on the advisability for Austin establishing an independent board for operating the Austin Electric Utility and related bills in the House and Senate.
That's a dream question. Thank you very much. As many of you know, we're very concerned about a so-called independent board for Austin Energy. Austin Energy is an award-winning utility that has had and has very low rates by comparison to other electric utilities in the state. And it's largely because we as people have had the opportunity to influence our city council members. A group called CCARE, which is the largest businesses in the city, industry and commercial, that's actually headquartered out of the Chamber of Commerce, is lobbying to have an independent board created with professionals that would govern and operate Austin Energy. And the reason they have is they think that there's too much influence of ordinary citizens on Austin Energy, and so they think that a professional board would keep things operated like a normal utility. Well, frankly, if it had been operated like a normal utility, we wouldn't have all the green programs, we wouldn't have the energy efficiency programs, we wouldn't have a climate program, we wouldn't have some of the best low-income programs in the nation, and we wouldn't have a focus on creating jobs with our utility money as we have done so here in Austin, because our elected officials have said these are the policies we have in front of us that we want to adopt. And instead, we would have a utility managed that looks like and acts like every other utility in the United States. We call them the brown utilities, and as opposed to the green utilities. Where we are now is that there was a long hearing on Thursday night, and Councilwoman Laura Morrison, bless her, changed the paradigm and said, I've looked at all of the issues in front of Austin Energy over the last 3 years, I think, since 1996. 40% of them are rote, approving purchases, supply contracts. We ought to have somebody do that, maybe give a boost to EUC or whatever, but give them a greater authority to do that. But the other 60% is stuff that really matters. It's policy decisions we ought to retain. So she made the motion, and we had, the council generally went along with her to say, let's just separate the governance, and we'll keep doing the important stuff, and we'll give somebody else the right to do that other stuff. There is a bill pending in the legislature sponsored by State Senator Watson and Representative Rodriguez that would basically change the city charter without a vote to authorize the independent board to manage the utility without having it go through the city manager's operations. That bill has passed the Senate, it is now in the House, and after Thursday night, we don't really know whether they're going to proceed with that. But at this point, we oppose the Rodriguez bill because basically we think that there ought to be a vote of the people on such a profound change in the way we manage our city, and are urging that to occur in 2014 or 2015 when the new council comes in. And the Statesman editorial board has been particularly effective and has raised this issue as recently as this morning in their editorials. And so we would like to ask people to continue to oppose the Rodriguez bill, or Watson-Rodriguez bill in the House as well. But part of the reason it's not on the priority list is because it's kind of gone into, we don't know what we're doing land since Thursday night. And gratefully, the city council really listened to the people as opposed to seeking. Oh, and let me also just nail the point home. We've all been wondering, what's the hurry? Why do we need to do this? And it's been a big mystery. And partially it was because of the fear that Austin be deregulated by the legislature. That bill has not been introduced. It was because it might be affected by the rate case. The rate case is settled. That's not a big fear anymore. What we did discover, however, is that Seacare represents 13 companies that all get their electricity at below the rates that we as citizens pay, below what's called cost of service, which is the break-even point for the utility. And they are deathly afraid that city council will not allow them to continue to get those below cost of service rates. And they think that they can manipulate a board better than they can city council, especially a professional, business-oriented board. And so part of the hurry is they want to get this done during a moment of vulnerability, so city council will continue to give them, or the board would continue to give them the rates. And so Laura Morrison called them out on that on Thursday night and got a 5-2 vote, I believe it was, that basically said, whatever happens, we're still going to make Seacare and the special contract customers pay the full cost of electricity in 2015 and beyond. And so she won that vote handily. So we may, we may have diffused even that. So it's an emerging drama. It's one of the things I love about my job is it isn't boring. Every day there's some new wrinkle going on.
Thank you for being here, Smitty. It's sort of not inspiring to hear about the future of our climate with our oil and gas lobby. Is the federal government our only hope of restraining some of our power generation, as well as helping us to promote solar, wind, and electric vehicles? I know the Attorney General is trying to prevent the feds from enforcing anything related to clean air. What is your take on the feds' intervention to kind of undo some of the damage that Texas is doing to the nation?
That's a really good question and a very complex one. The good news is that EPA is now requiring for coal plants that they reduce their emissions, new coal plants, through a series of emissions control devices. And that's the first step. They also have adopted new automobile efficiency standards that will require us to meet, I think, 50-something miles per gallon by 2025, is it? I believe it is. So we're going to see significant reduction in emissions. And they also are continuing to develop and evolve electric vehicle technology, which, depending on where you live, makes a lot of sense in terms of emission reductions. Being in Austin, our electric vehicles, although powered by the electrical grid, the emissions are roughly a third of what they would be if they were powered from traditional gas sources, gasoline sources. So it's a big difference, even though there are emissions that come from the electric grid at the moment. So we are in a standoff position where Governor Abbott has sued EPA time and time again. My memory is there are 23 different lawsuits he's filed against EPA trying to enjoin them from taking any progressive actions in Texas. And we're about 50-50 in terms of the win-loss ratio on those lawsuits. It is clear that EPA will not back down on the climate challenge, that there are a number of different initiatives being proposed by EPA to regulate more tightly oil and gas sector and the existing sources of climate generation. The only way they have to do that is through a loophole or a wormhole, I guess would be the better way to describe it, created by the very Republican-dominated Supreme Court that says this is a pollutant within the purview of the EPA that they have the authority to regulate. They're having to do it through rulemaking. We have no hope that Congress will pass anything progressive, at least in the next 18 months with this current Congress. It would be our hope that they will be able to do something should Congress change. But at this moment, it's all got to be based on EPA. So the next battle is who gets, whether Gina McCarthy becomes the new administrator of the EPA, and should she get that office, watch out. I have met Gina McCarthy on 3 occasions, and she is one of the toughest people I have ever met. And she will not back down. And so if she is finally nominated, I think we're going to have an EPA administrator that will make tremendous progress during the rest of the Obama administration.
Smitty, thank you for a real insider's perspective on some of the struggles ahead, and thank you for your work. Please come back and talk to us again.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I appreciate all that you do and all your questions.